Hello, I'm Sue Andersen, grief guide and yoga teacher, dedicated to helping individuals navigate the challenging journey of loss. Welcome to Growth from Grief, where I aim to offer strategies to transition from the depths of grief to the path of healing. Whatever loss you are grappling with, here you'll discover support to ease both the physical and emotional burdens of grief. Together, let's embark on a journey towards strength, peace, and healing. I'm so glad you are here. Hi, and welcome to Growth from Grief. I'm your host, Sue Andersen. In today's episode, I want to start with a question for you. And that question is, what's the hardest part of your grief? What's the hardest part of your grief? Now, I realize that the hardest part of your grief may depend on where you are in your grief journey. And it may also depend on what your loss is. For example, if you lost a job, the hardest part of your grief may be financial. You might be worried about how you're going to make ends meet. And this worry may cause stress and anxiety. You may also, if it's something like, again, losing a job, you might feel that people will think less of you. If you're an older individual, maybe it's going to be more difficult for you to find a new job, and that might affect your self-worth. And so the grief over the loss of a job could be affecting your identity, who you are, where do you go from here? Who are you now? And that certainly could be very difficult in terms of losing a job. For those who've lost a close loved one, such as a parent, a sibling, or a best friend, the person who has died very close to you, and maybe for you, the hardest part right now is navigating life without this person. Maybe you feel a very deep void now that this person is no longer here with you. When my roommate from college died from cancer, we were all in our mid-20s. And I remember after she died, talking with her mom and how they felt, her mom and her sister, who were caring for her, how they felt such a void in their life after she died. Not only because they were missing her, but because now they had a lot of time on their hands. And what do they do now? That was a big void. And it was part of their mourning, part of their grief. They had to feel these emotions associated with that void. And over time, just let, I guess, time take its course, and slowly their life changed and other things came up that they were doing, and that void was filled over time. You're not trying to replace, so you can't go and care for another person, for example, and feel like that's going to replace that void. That's going to fill that void and replace that person, because you can't replace the person who died. It's like when my dad died and I was in my early 30s, and we had gotten into the habit of talking on the phone once a week. And my dad liked to chat, talked about all kinds of things. And then when he died, there was that void for me. was strange not being able to pick up the phone and talk with him. And I didn't try to fill that with calling somebody else, every Thursday night at 5 o'clock or whatever. I just had to let it take its course. I had to let myself feel that. And over time, something else kind of, again, just naturally filled that space. So that's a very difficult thing. That could be very hard for you early on in your grief if you're losing or if you've lost a person that's very close to you, person like a family member. So, again, it's just really important to feel all the emotions and let yourself find ways of healing. And slowly that shift will happen. What's the hardest thing about your grief? One of my Yoga for Grief students expressed that the hardest thing for her is the multiple layers of loss. She experienced the death of friends and family members over a very short period of time. I think it was 3 or 4 years. And also, there was sickness, illness in the family that kind of compounded that grief. It was just one thing after another for her, and she was struggling trying to figure out how to deal with this. It was difficult for her. She felt like there wasn't enough time for her to mourn or grieve each individual and each loss because they came so close together. How do you wrap your head around that? Right? It was complicated for her, complex. So, one of the things to think about when you find yourself in a situation where you can't find a way to unpack this grief, like this individual who had all of these losses in one uh, period of time close together, that it might be time to think about therapy, talking to someone, whether it's individual or maybe a group, having the time to talk with somebody who's qualified to help you work through this. They might be able to help you unpack all the layers. And certainly, talking to a counselor would be something for anyone to do, right? In no matter what your loss is. But I think when it's complex, that might be really helpful. Like talking with somebody, talking it out could be really helpful for you. When my dad passed away in my 30s, I was in my mid 30s. Prior to that, from early 20s, I had experienced multiple losses. Friends, I mentioned my college friend, family members, sudden death, people that were ill over time. And this was back in the 70s and 80s. And at that time, it really wasn't thought about, in terms of seeing a counselor. People didn't bring that up. It was, I learned through my family, through watching other people in my family, that yes, you were mourning at that funeral or service. Sometime after that, your outward expression, your tears, your sadness was quote unquote okay. But after a certain period of time, you were expected to just keep moving, keep going forward. You just dealt with it. I recognized that for myself years later that I still had emotions that I had not dealt with. I had anger, I had feelings of guilt, And they would come up every now and then, but I didn't recognize it at the time. It really wasn't until the death of my son that a lot of these other emotions from these past losses kind of came up and I needed to deal with those. And I did talk with a counselor and I did go to a couple of groups, and it was helpful to me at the time, very helpful to me early on in my loss of my son. When I posed this question, what's the hardest thing about your grief, to my email list back, I don't know, 7, 8 months ago, a couple of people reached out to express the loneliness and isolation that they felt. Person that they relied on, that was their confidant, that was the person they would be with all the time, speak with, and that was the person who died. And so now they were in a situation where they felt very isolated. They were lonely. They didn't have another close relationship. They felt like they didn't have somebody close to them that they could talk with about how they were feeling. So it was really difficult for these people. It took them time. And, I think it's important to understand that when we do have a loss of somebody that's very close to us, maybe it's your spouse, your partner, your mom, your dad, somebody that you're very close with, it's it takes time to adjust to that, of course, but you may find that you need to, after a certain amount of time when you feel ready, of course, to kind of get out of that comfort zone, if you will, and seek out other people that maybe have a similar interest. Maybe join a group or talk to a therapist. Maybe find something interesting that you would like to do. Maybe it's something that you did with the person who died and you want to continue doing that. An art class. Maybe it was volunteering. I'm not saying this is easy to do. I feel that it's important to do. It's important to take that chance to move forward in your life. So it does take time. It's the hardest thing for you about your grief. And don't feel like you have to rush something. I think when you kind of have a feeling that, okay, I need to move a little bit in a different direction, that even though it's scary, that you go ahead and you just try that. Another student of mine reached out to tell me that the hardest thing for her was to let go of her emotions, her sadness around the death of her daughter. She felt like if she released these emotions, if she expressed these emotions, that it was kind of like she was losing a part of her daughter. So the pain was associated with her daughter. It was really difficult for her to let go. And she told me that after she took the grief class and was able to move her body, that she really felt wonderful. She let go of some of these emotions that she was holding on to. They were stuck in her body. She could feel it. She could feel the difference after the class. And she realized that releasing these emotions in no way was also forgetting about her daughter. She wasn't losing her daughter again or forgetting about her daughter. She was detaching those emotions from the memory of her daughter. And she was just letting go of the guilt, letting go of the sadness. And by doing that, by doing this yoga, these movements, these powerful poses, she let go of some of the stuck emotion and she was able to feel more love. It opened up something in her. It was cathartic for her taking this yoga for grief class. I'd like you to think about activities that can help you release emotions, physical movements. I mentioned that in my yoga for grief classes, we do powerful movements that can help you let go of emotions that really feel stuck. And some of this powerful activity is really, really helpful. And so I invite you to look for ways to let go of your grief. Maybe it's walking and pumping your arms. Maybe it's running. Maybe it's gardening. Maybe it's boxing. But something that you can do that will help you release some of this stuck emotion, because that could be the hardest thing about your grief, the emotion that's stuck in your body. And if you're looking for other ways to let go of your grief, I invite you to take a look at this free guide that I have on my website. It's called Free Tips for Grief Relief, and you can get it at sueandersonyoga.com/guide. And it's just something that you might want to take a look at. So, what's the hardest thing about your grief? Another person that answered this question told me that they felt that grief was all consuming. They didn't know when it was going to end. They were in early stages of their loss, and it was just all consuming to them. And no matter what your grief is, whether you've lost someone to death or you're going through a divorce, you've lost your job, home, these can all be devastating. And in these early stages of your loss, you might feel like these emotions and these thoughts will never end. And I think this is very common. You can try different techniques to get out of your head because maybe at this point, thoughts are just consuming you. Think about that monkey mind or the hamster wheel where you just have those thoughts that are running around your head. One of the things that can help you to release the thoughts, or at least soften these thoughts, is to focus on your breath. And you may have heard of this, you may have tried it yourself. Inhaling through the nose and then exhaling through the nose. And a technique to try is inhaling for a count of, say, 3 and exhaling to a count of, say, 4. Let the exhales be longer. And as you are taking these breaths, you may want to bring your awareness to what the breath feels like in your nostrils. So as you breathe in, what does that breath feel like? Is it cool? Is it warm? And as you breathe out, what does that feel like? So focusing on the breath really does help in terms of removing some of that chatter that's going on in the mind. It can be helpful. And I'm not saying that this is easy, especially in early days, But just try it. I mean, even if you're taking 3 or 4 breaths and you give yourself that time to just notice your breath, focusing on something different, getting out of your head. The last thing that I want to mention when we think about the hardest thing about grief is when you're all of a sudden just hit with grief emotion. Maybe your loss has been a year or 2 or even 5 years in the past, and all of a sudden something triggers the emotion. Could be a song, could be a scent, a smell, could be a place, could be something that you found. And all of a sudden, wham, you're just hit with those emotions and you're surprised. And all of a sudden, you start crying or you feel like your body is just hit with a ton of bricks and you need to just rest. You need to stay in your bed. Depending on, again, how far along you are in this grief journey, this may last a little bit longer. You may feel these kinds of sudden emotions happen a little bit closer together, especially if you're earlier in your grief. Maybe you're out a couple of years. One thing I can tell you is that over time, these emotions, these bursts of emotion, these bursts of grief, they will happen, but the emotions and maybe your recovery from it, if you will, using the term recovery, will be a little bit softer. The emotions will be softer. They're not as intense. And you will allow yourself to cry, to take that nap, to go for a walk, because you recognize what's happening and you allow it and you feel those feelings. It may, if you are a year or 2 or even 3 years out, maybe it's disconcerting to you. Oh my gosh, I thought I was feeling better. And now here it is again, these waves of emotion. Again, the important thing is to allow yourself to feel it, to give yourself time, feel the emotions, try the walking, try the breathing, try the resting. Rest. Boy, that's something we don't do very often, is it? It's an important part of the yoga for grief classes, for example. We always do restorative yoga at the end because it's so important to rest. So don't be afraid of just resting. And remember, emotions, they soften over time. We still have that love, the person or the pet. We still remember and maybe have fond memories of a job or a house. But the emotion associated with the loss will get softer. Those strong emotions will get softer. And as you release emotion, you open up for joy. What's the hardest thing about your grief? I'm interested to hear from you. Please reach out to me. I'd love to hear what your hardest thing is about your grief. Thanks for listening to this episode, and I look forward to seeing you soon.